This is the class number 14 of the series of history on the 19th century. We left last class discussing the whole problem of how Jews are going to be integrating themselves into society. I just wanted to remind you that Jews now in the 19th century, following the integration and the time of citizenship, the Jews are everywhere. Just, there are Jews organizing the Rothschilds and making railways in Europe, all over Europe. Montefiore is creating railways in the Balkans and the Ottoman Empire. In France, they're giving money to the modernization of Paris. So these are new things in which Jews are everywhere. They're in political movements. They are writers. They're historians. I want to point out particularly one man and a whole group of people who tried to study Judaism in a very scientific way, in a way. They were interested in Judaism, but they were not interested in just learning Talmud. They were interested in seeing Jewish culture in all its varieties, whether it was poetry, and particularly history. And they called this the science of Judaism, Wissenschaft des Judentums. They created an organization for the Wissenschaft des Judentums, and there they produced a lot of scholars. Of course, one of the most important scholars was Heinrich Graetz, who created one of the most important histories, Jewish history, which is even read today as a historian. He read manuscripts, he researched. He was a very important person in this movement. He was born in 1794, and he created a whole institute. Many of them were important people. Leopold Zunz was the creator of this, Heinrich Graetz. Interestingly enough, although they created many historians and scientists and writers, many of them, when they wanted to get to university, they abandoned Judaism. One of them, the famous person, Edward Gans, famous professor, became a professor to get a university position. He embraced Christianity. Heinrich Heine also was another member of this group. So we see that this group was already grappling with how to deal with Judaism outside of a religious traditional form. And one of the things that they did is investigating liturgy, to try to see how they could adjust liturgy to the new synagogues that they were creating. And so Zunz already, although he protested against the breaking with the Talmud, and even, some people were saying, let's abandon the concept of Shabbat. They started to say the kids are going to school on Saturday, so they have to allow me to write. So Zunz was particularly a traditionalist, but the movement away from tradition had already set in motion. Judaism became a religion more than a nation. And as a religion, they were trying to avoid even the word Jew. They were considered to be Israelites or Hebrews of the Mosaic faith. In the synagogues, they started to create all kinds of rituals, sermons in German. The synagogue had a decorum, not like a regular shtibel or traditional Jewish place, like a German synagogue. They introduced the organ. One of the first places, first Reformed synagogue can be traced to the year 1818 in Berlin, when a man by the name of Beer, Jacob Herz Beer, created the synagogue called the Beer Synagogue. His son was the opera composer Giacomo Meyerbeer. So this was the first attempt at a Reformed synagogue, which eventually closed when other synagogues started to pop out in different ways. In London, a similar synagogue is created in 1836. And we will see later that this also travels to America. We will discuss in America also. About the same time, in the 1840s, Isaac May Wise in Cincinnati begins the process, very similar to what was happening in Europe. The leader of this group, the intellectual leader of this group, is somebody with the name of Abraham Geiger. Abraham Geiger was a scholar. He introduced the concept of that the Torah was not a divine document, but it was simply something that was several kinds of documents, called the famous documentary theory, so that the Torah was divided into, this from this author and that author, and this documentary theory, almost destroyed the entire concept of revelation. And in fact, he said that every generation added new things to the idea of Jewish tradition, and they changed. And of course, we can also change. I mean, you know where it goes. Obviously, there is no tradition, nothing to keep. You can do whatever you want because each generation is free. As they say, the Constitution is a living organism, so you can do whatever you want with it. And he particularly, Geiger emphasized that the only part of Judaism that was valuable was the prophetic aspect, the ethical aspect. All the rituals were passé and unnecessary. And if any ritual was to be created, it had to be created in the line of the modern times. It is interesting that there's a conference in Frankfurt, the year 1845, where many rabbis, or these modern rabbis, come in. One of the rabbis who comes in is the rabbi from Breslau, Zachariah Frankel. And he, when he sees that this conference is allowing the desecration of Shabbat, and he says that, they see that they're going to eliminate all references to the restoration of Jewish people in Palestine. And the idea of the Messiah, the idea of the redemption is all thrown out of the window. So Zachariah Frankel withdraws from this conference because he's a traditionalist. And we will see in a moment that Zachariah Frankel becomes, in a way, by withdrawing from the reform, he becomes the father, the intellectual father of what will be eventually the conservative movement later on. Frankel has a rabbinical seminary in Breslau as well. While all of these things were happening, the government was paying the salaries of the ministers. And the Jews who were Orthodox were in the same synagogues as these people, and they objected to the idea of introducing an organ or other changes in the ritual. So the only solution for these people was to try to create small little prayer groups outside of the main synagogues, until finally one man took and in fact the observant Jews in Frankfurt, for example, they became very few. They said only 100 families remain in observant families of the thousands of Jews. So finally, a Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, who born in 1808, and who had been a fellow student of Geiger in Bonn. Interestingly enough, they both were at the same time at the same university in Bonn. He had written a very important book called 19 Letters of Ben Uziel, where he explains that the mitzvot are divine and that they have an effect on our spiritual character, and therefore that we need to maintain these mitzvot, that although we do have a universal mission to the world, that mission can only be accomplished if we maintain our separateness and our reserves of mitzvot. This is what we today call orthodoxy, which of course was a sort of a presentation of traditional Judaism. But he also, one of the most important revolutionary decisions that he made was to create actually the sense of separation. He said all Orthodox people should leave those synagogues and not join forces with the reform. And this actually, he created the synagogue Kahal Hades Yeshurun in Frankfurt. And the name Hades Yeshurun, as you know, remains an important name in America as well, with the descendants of Rabbi Hirsch. And so we have here, eventually, Zachariah Frankel will become the architect of the conservative movement, which is going to be developed in America with the force of Solomon Schechter. Solomon Schechter is a scholar in Cambridge, He was famous for discovering the Hebrew manuscript or Hebrew text of the Ben Sira. We had been lost. We had thought that only the Ben Sira was only in translation in Greek and Latin, but he discovered the Hebrew, large portions of the Ben Sira in Hebrew. And he also was famous in the year 1897 to discover the Cairo Geniza, which found all these fragments of many important times, manuscripts, and Talmudic times and Geonic times, which are very important for our knowledge of history. He was invited in America by the Jewish Theological Seminary, where he became the most important rector. We will discuss this in next week when we talk about America. But you see here that here we see the beginning of these three movements: the Reform movement, the Conservative movement, and the Orthodox movement that are going to be developed in America this time on. We talked a great deal about Western Europe, talked about England, and we talked about France and Germany, particularly in the development of the citizenship and these religious movement. Let me take you for a moment aside to discuss a whole different community, the Jews in Russia. And, forgive me for, here obviously we are discussing so many things all at once, but the 19th century is full of events. And so we have to look a little bit geographically. It is important to analyze Russian Jews separately because they were not part of the same elan that was happening in Western Europe. Partly because the government, the Tsar was not, interested in any kind of giving the Jews any rights. In fact, when the Jews of Poland is divided in the year 1772, actually, after this year, Poland ceases to exist as Poland until the 20th century. One part is taken by Prussia, one is taken by Austria, and the other part is taken by Russia. It's divided. The Jews that were mostly in Eastern Poland are absorbed by Russia. And Russia does not let these people, more than in a certain area. It's called the Pale of Settlement. So it doesn't incorporate it as full citizens, doesn't allow them to move freely. It allows them only to be in this Pale of Settlements area of Ukraine, Belarus, and Crimea, and Eastern Poland. And if they wanted to move away from this area, they needed a special passport to do business, and they returned to their original place. They could not live in Moscow and St. Petersburg and so on. The Jews in Galicia, which were under the Austrian domination, they were in better position. So it's interesting that the Jews in Russia are given, if they want to do business, they're giving a special taxes. And also the Jews are, one of the occupations of the Jews, interestingly enough, was they had taverns and they sold liquor to the peasants. So whenever peasants were acting poorly or badly or evil, the Russian government accused the Jews of being the reason for this keeping these taverns. I want to point out a very important aspect. There are Jews in Russia who are trying to create also new schools on the Mendelssohnian kind of philosophy, secular education, modernizing, teaching the children not only Talmud and Bible, but other documents. These are not necessarily very successful in Russia. What is successful in Russia and in Poland, and very important, is the development of the yeshivot. A great disciple of the Vilna Gaon, Rav Chaim of Volozhin, creates a very important yeshiva in Volozhin, and that also spreads, all over Poland. And there are yeshivot and rabbis in every town. Scholarship becomes a very important part of Jewish life in Russia and Poland. I want to point out, by the way, that although the Jews were very poor, they maintained numerous activities of tzedakah helping one another, helping the poor rise, the orphans, the widows. They're creating the courts to solve social problems, and all under the aegis of the Talmid Chacham, the scholar, the rabbi, and the yeshiva. It's interesting that the yeshiva of Volozhin, which was like the Harvard of the yeshivot, actually is also forced to accept a secular curriculum. And when they do that, the rabbi closes the yeshiva, and it never reopens afterwards. But there are other yeshivot that continue to be independent, especially in farther areas. A very important development of this time, in addition to the yeshiva world, the Lithuanian type of yeshiva, we already talked a little bit about the Hasidic communities that we already discussed, and they continue almost parallel to the yeshiva world. Some of them in the yeshivot, some of them in the same yeshivot, some in different yeshivot, but this Hasidic community continues to maintain its own separateness from the other Jews. But in the Lithuanian type of yeshiva, a new development occurs, and that is called the Musar movement. The Musar movement is a movement initiated by a famous Rabbi Israel Lipkin of the city of Salant. Normally, because it comes from Salant, we call him the Salanter, Israel Salanter. Born in 1810, and died in 1883. He was a very special rabbi with a great deal of kindness and love for people, who wanted people to, in yeshivot, that they should study ethics. You know, the books of the Path of the Just, and other books written to refine, not only to study Talmud and legal matters, but to refine the character of the students. And morality, ethical studies were initiated in this time. And to this very day, the yeshivot of the Lithuanian yeshivot always have the study of philosophy and Musar as part of their curriculum. The Hasidic yeshivot do not need this Musar because they have their own study of Hasidic texts, which also contain a lot of the same elements and of morality and ethical studies. The most important rabbi in this area is the Nosson Tzvi Finkel, who's called who makes a very important yeshiva in Slobodka, and he's called the Alter of Slobodka, a very influential rabbi. Rabbi Israel Salanter was a very famous man with many beautiful stories. I want to tell you quick two stories about him. A famous story about him is that on one night of Yom Kippur, everybody was waiting for him to start Kol Nidre, and he's not there. And they wait and they wait and they wait, and they don't know what's going on. Now it's late, an hour late, and they ask, where is the rabbi? So they go and they look from the town, and they see that the rabbi is holding a baby in his arms, and the baby is crying. And they say, Rabbi, what happened? He said, well, the parents went to the synagogue. They wanted to hear Kol Nidre. I passed by, I saw the baby was crying, and I came, and nobody was around. So I came to help the baby. Another beautiful story about him, which is beautiful, is he insisted on the students that they should always wash their hands, with a lot of water. In fact, he said that, the water is connected with parnasa, with income. You should not be stingy when you wash your hands. On one occasion, they were starting at an inn, and they saw that Rabbi Israel Salanter was using very little water, minimal amount of water, 4 ounces, which normally you use half a gallon. And they wonder, and they said, Rabbi, what happened? You always insist that you should have so much water, and today you're using so little. He says, look at the lady who's bringing the water. The water, she has to go outside and pump from a pump the water and bring it up with herself. I don't want to cause her to go outside and work so hard. This is the man who emphasized ethics. The Musar movement created many books. We do not have time today to analyze it, but look it up, called Musar. Musar in Hebrew means ethics. But let's go back a little bit to the Russian Jews and what's happening in Russia. So we talked a little bit about the intellectual, the challenge of the Mendelssohnian modern secularization that was coming in, was not very successful, not like in Germany. The spread really explosion of the yeshiva in the yeshiva world, starting with Rav Chaim Volozhin and many other rabbis, together with the Musaf movement of Rabbi Israel Salanter. One very important development that was happening in Russia. The Russian needs in the army. They need conscripts. So they make an edict at the beginning of the century. Tsar Nicholas I, called the Cantonist Decree, forced the conscription of Jewish children at the age of 16 or 17, forced them to be in the army for 25 years. This, obviously, without having any community, without access to kosher food, these kids, when they came back, they were no longer, they didn't even remember they were Jews. So it was a terrible thing for the Jewish community, and they tried to stop it in so many ways, but they were not successful. This was one of the great calamities that happened to the Jewish community. They tried to avoid, to hide the children as much as possible. In some cases, some rich people, the community had to produce a certain number of people. And in some communities, the rich paid so that the poor people, the kids of the poor will go. Something that especially Rabbi Salanter was very much critical of. And on one occasion he said, you should not even pray to a God if you do such things. But the Cantonist decree was affected a lot of people. In addition to this, every time there was an economic crisis, the Russians would go around and say, okay, let's go and kill some Jews and break some homes. Something that unfortunately here in America this year, we are accustomed to people going out, breaking windows and making riots. This in Russia happened all the time. They're called the pogrom. Pogrom is a Russian word for the word, let's wreak havoc. Let's destroy something. So pogrom, everyone came and they all attacked the Jews. Many of them. But the most important were the pogroms that happened in 1881. The Tsar is assassinated, and the police wants to accuse the Jews of being behind the assassination, even though there was no proof. Pogroms multiply, and terrible, terrible things. Jews are expelled and from the towns, they're deported, they're arrested. It's a terrible, terrible thing. The worst pogrom of all was the pogrom of Kishinev. In 1903, April 6 and 7, the Russians came and killed Jews, 118 in the town of Kishinev, 1,200 wounded. And the saddest part, and pay attention to this, was that although it was not spontaneous, because the moment the Tsar said stop, that moment it stopped, which means he was able to control that pogrom. I want to talk quickly about this terrible page in the Jewish history of Russian Jews, which was the reason behind the great emigration that we will see in a moment. I want to read a description of the pogrom printed in the New York Times, 1903. It is impossible to account the amounts of goods destroyed in a few hours. The hooray of the rioting, the pitiful cries of the victims. Wherever a Jew was met, he was savagely beaten into insensibility. One Jew was dragged from a streetcar and beaten until the mob thought he was dead. Every Jewish household was broken into. The mob entered the synagogue, defiled the scrolls of the law. The conduct of the Christians was disgraceful. They made no attempt to check the rioting. They simply walked around enjoying the sport. On Tuesday, the third day, when it became known that the troops had received orders to shoot, the rioters ceased. After 2 days of mayhem, the Tsar said, okay, enough, mission accomplished. And immediately it was stopped. As soon as the Tsar said stop, it stopped. This Kishinev pogrom attracted international attention. Chaim Nachman Bialik, the poet laureate of Israel, one of the greatest poets in Hebrew since the Yehuda Halevi, wrote a famous poem called Be'ir HaHarga. a terrible thing. We do not have a time to read it, but I recommend it. Chaim Nachman Bialik, a great poet who came to Israel in the 20th century. So because of all of this, Jews in Russia, beginning in 1881, begin a very serious emigration. Between 1881 and 1914, 50,000 Jews left Russia. There's a baron, a rich man who, Baron Maurice de Hirsch, we will see in a moment when we talk about Zionism, a Russian baron who organizes a Jewish colonization association called the ICA, to bring Jews to South America. Many of these Jews are going to Brazil and to Argentina. For Argentina, they are created a special colony of Russian Jews called Mosesville. And this is the famous Jewish gauchos that you find in Argentina. This is from the Baron de Hirsch who organized the emigration. He was against Herzl. He didn't want Jews to go to Palestine. So he tried to organize them to move into Argentina or to Brazil or eventually to the USA. By the end of the century, about 1 million people had left Eastern Europe, and the largest number of them went to America. The exodus from Russia was greater than since the time of the Spanish Inquisition. In Russia, things continued to be very bad, and I want to continue a little bit further into the 20th century. In 1911, a poor Jewish laborer, Mendel Baylis, was arrested in Kiev for murdering a Christian child. And the accusation was that he did it for the blood of Passover, the usual blood libel. After 2 years ordeal and many anti-Semitic attacks, he is finally released. All the disaster in Russia creates what is called activism. And the activism goes really in addition to immigration. It causes people to do something about it. One of them is going to be the famous poet, scholar, and eventual great political leader, Vladimir Jabotinsky, who realizes that the situation in Russia is untenable, and he encourages people like Herzl to move to Palestine. And we know that very important person, we do not have time to analyze it, but it is one of the results of these terrible events in Russia. The other person, the other type of person that this creates is communists. And the Jews who are maligned, persecuted, and attacked finally want to do something about changing the society. And they align themselves with the communists who promise that they're going to change society and Jews are nothing's going to happen to them. And the good example would be Leon Trotsky, 1880 to 1940. He totally severs his connection to Judaism, even though he was connected to a rabbi. And when the rabbi says, if you want to care about people, why don't you care about the Jews? He said, I'm not a Jew, I am a social democrat, that's all. So Trotsky becomes a revolutionary. And in fact, no one more than Trotsky has made the concept of the popular identification of Jews with communists that will occur in Nazi Germany as well. As the rabbi said, Trotskys make the revolutions and the Bronsteins pay the price. And that is the terrible story of the Jews of Russia. It's interesting that Trotsky ridiculed Zionism. And he said, it's never going to be. You'll never be able to go to Palestine, return to Israel. Perhaps if he had hope, he would have had changed his mind. But of course, as we will see in a moment, Zionism was a madman's concept. Nobody thought that it was possible. As the famous, Herzl was actually accused of being a madman. And, you know, his famous statement was, Im tirtzu ein zu agada. If you want it, it's not a dream. But for most people, it was a crazy dream. Going to now into discussing this very important part. So we left England, we left France and Germany and Russia. So let's talk a little bit about all of these places together, about something that was happening in the 19th century. And I want to point out that The 19th century is actually can be called the century of the national movements. Something happened in the 19th century. As these nations started to emerge and call themselves French, German, Italians, each of them was associated themselves with their own past. They wanted to go back to remember their traditions. And this is what we call the Romantic period. Romanticism is an attempt to go back to your past and to imagine and relive it with great emotions and happiness. Part of this Romanticism was to remember how great our ancestors were. So each nation went back to its own past. Once you have nationalism and the sense of how great we are, and as an example, just if you have a moment one day to watch Wagner's Meistersinger, you see the pride of the Germans in their past. The Jew was an alien. He could not relate to this. So immediately, every nation, every person looked at the Jews and says, who are you? You cannot remember anything of our past. You're an alien. So nationalism became the religion of Europe, and the Jew in that had no place. And that's why the Jews were left alone, were hated. And there was a question of what do we do with the Jews? The Jewish question. And because of this, we can see that anti-Semitism started to grow. Let's talk a little bit about anti-Semitism. The word anti-Semitism was coined by Wilhelm Marr in a book that he wrote called The Victory of Judaism over Germandom. So it is der Sieg des Judentums über das Germanentum. And what he said was Jews had conquered Germany. Their ideas had infiltrated. A concept that Nietzsche in philosophy also said something very similar. So you have this concept of the anti-Semitism. Already in Germany, you had every once in a while anti-Semitic groups called the Hep. Is it Hep Jude Verek? Hep Jew croak. The word Hep was probably going back to the time of the Crusades, and the people think that the H of Hep is Jerusalem, and E is est, Latin, perdita, P. So Jerusalem es perdita means Jerusalem is lost. So that returns to the anti-Semitism of the Middle Ages. There's also other people who begin to say Jews cannot change because they're a different race. And you have these Jews as a race, the famous book by Eugen Düring. So this tremendous amount of anti-Semitism is spreading all over Europe. The most important of all, and in Russia, there's a book, a forgery, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is produced by the Russian police to say that the Jews dominate the world. Which, of course, having seen the great success that Jews had in Europe, like the Rothschilds, Montefiore, and others, it was not a baseless concept. The Jews were prominent, but they were not dominating. They were merchants like anybody else. It was just Jews excel. The most flagrant of all these times of anti-Semitism was the case of the Alfred Dreyfus, the Captain Alfred Dreyfus. On October 15, 1894, Captain Alfred Dreyfus, an Alsatian Jew, who was a part of the French army, was accused of passing information to the Germans, who were the enemies. He's arrested in 1895, degraded, and sent to Devil's Island, an island off the coast of the South American coast. Drummond, a famous anti-Semite, continues to speak against the Jews, not only about Dreyfus, and he says that France is dominated by the Jews. He writes a pamphlet called La France Juive. Finally, in 1897, thanks to the work of Colonel Picard, Dreyfus is brought back to Paris. A new trial occurs. There's a whole campaign in Paris, in France. Émile Zola and many others say that this was an injustice. The famous article by Émile Zola called J'accuse, I accuse. But there were many people in France who were anti-Semites, and they called the anti-Dreyfusards. So the Dreyfusards and the anti-Dreyfusards. The most important aspect of this is not only that there was anti-Semitism, but what interesting happens in 1895, when Dreyfus was being degraded, ridiculed, and his uniform torn from him. The crowd said, "Mort a Dreyfus and mort aux Juifs." Death to Dreyfus and death to the Jews. It is at this time that this man, a young journalist from Vienna, who was covering the story of France, begins to realize that Jews cannot remain in France or in Europe. And then is what he dreams, that Jews should have their own state. And he writes in 2 years later, the famous book, Judenstaat, the Jewish state. The concept of creating a state where Jews be able to go. Under the shock of pogroms and anti-Semitic attack, Jews had started to dream of the return to the ancient land even before Herzl. The Gaon of Vilna had sent the students to Israel. In 1834, Rabbi Yehuda al-Kelai publishes a book telling people that we should create colonies in Israel. In fact, it's interesting that a grandfather of Herzl was one of the disciples of Rabbi Yehuda al-Kelai. Another famous Ashkenazi rabbi, Hirsch Kalischer, writes to the Rothschilds in 1836, saying that the redemption will come only through human hands, and we should do something about that. Rothschild actually begins to help some of the communities. Later on, in the year 1880, some Jews begin to move into Israel, what is called the first Aliyah. We will discuss this in the next class. I want to end with two, before we finish this class, I want to end with two very beautiful stories. A British author, George Eliot, was a woman actually, had met a Jew from Silesia, Poland, and this man was a librarian at the British Museum, taught her Hebrew and spoke about Israel and introduced her to the concept of the Jewish history. And she was so fascinated that she wrote a novel called Daniel Deronda, one of the very great classics of British English literature. The book, Daniel Deronda, is a story of a young man who discovers he's Jewish and decides to become the leader of a group of people who move to Israel and creates a state in the land of Israel. That's what the novel is about. The novel inspires so many people, and it became a classic in English literature. It inspired, and they said that there was a young man, a Russian Jew in Paris, who saw the book, translated into French, and he was inspired to go to Israel. His name was Eliezer Ben Yehuda, the famous one who revived the Hebrew language. Christians were talking about, I want to tell, by the way, in the restoration of the Jews to Palestine. This is what Christians write to Lord Palmerston in the middle of the 19th century, before Herzl. Listen to this. He writes to Lord Palmerston, who was then Foreign Secretary, 320 Christian petitioners. They say, the land of Palestine was bestowed by the sovereign of the universe upon the descendants of Abraham, And that so on, he's also decreed that they shall again return to the country, and that the Gentiles shall be employed as a means of their restoration. Jews, non-Jews. So Daniel de Ronda was a fiction, a man who was going to lead the Jews back to the state of Israel, to create a state of the Jews in Israel. That man came out of the fiction book 20 years after the book was written, and his name was Theodor Herzl. We will study in Hashem the next class, and we will continue to study the story of beautiful Zionism, how it creates Israel, and the reaction of the world.